far away. At the turning of the 7th millennium before the present era, the green valleys of southeastern Europe begin to receive something new. For thousands of years, these valleys, rivers, and forests have been the territory of roaming hunters and gatherers, people who follow the seasons, who track the movements of animals, and who know every fruiting tree and every bend of the river. Their world is already ancient. Yet, from further east and south, from lands warmed by earlier suns, another way of life is moving slowly but steadily toward them. Step by step, groups of people arrive carrying seeds. The seeds are small, hard, and easily lost in the soil, yet they hold within them the promise of transformation. Wheat, barley, and pulses, plants first tamed in the Fertile Crescent, are now being planted far from the wild grasses of their origin. These newcomers also guide animals, sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. They are no longer only hunters, but herders and cultivators. Archaeology names them the first farmers of Europe. Their settlements begin to dot the landscape. At first, the hunter-gatherers and the farmers live side by side. Rivers carry fish, forests yield berries, and meadows allow grazing. The archaeological record shows that the earliest farming groups often choose fertile alluvial plains and gentle hillsides where the soil is easy to turn, with wooden hoes and stone blades. Long timber houses appear, aligned with care, sometimes more than 30 meters in length. These are not temporary shelters, but durable structures capable of lasting through decades of use. In their post holes and ditches, traces of clay, daub, and charred wood remain even after 7,000 years. The planet at this time is warmer than during the Ice Age, yet it is not entirely stable. Glaciers have retreated, but rainfall varies greatly from year to year. Farmers must learn to cope with dry summers, cold winters, and sudden floods. The spread of farming is therefore slow. Each generation pushes a little further along rivers and valleys, clearing forests with fire and stone axes, always balancing between opportunity and risk. One striking fact emerges from genetic studies of human remains. These early farmers carry a distinctive ancestry linked to populations from Anatolia. Their movement into Europe is not only the spread of crops and animals, but the migration of whole families and communities. Yet, in many regions, traces of local hunter-gatherer ancestry appear in their bones, suggesting that the two ways of life do not remain separate forever. Sometimes they mingle through marriage and exchange. Sometimes they remain apart. Archaeologists still debate how peaceful or tense these encounters may have been. A lesser-known detail hides in the soil of Central Europe. In some settlements, researchers have found tiny charred remains of einkorn wheat grains, carefully preserved through burning. These are the oldest direct traces of farming in the region, silent witnesses of meals once cooked and eaten. Alongside them, stone sickles edged with flint show the wear of repeated cutting. The sickle gloss, a polish left on stone tools by silica from grasses, tells the story of harvests repeated over many seasons. As the forests recede and fields expand, Europe's ecosystems shift. Animals once widespread begin to retreat. Large herds of aurochs, wild cattle, are hunted but also penned, gradually pressured by human presence. Beavers vanish from rivers near villages. New clearings bring opportunities for other species, though wild plants that thrive on disturbed soil spread, and birds that feed on spilled grain follow the farmers. Every act of cutting and planting reshapes the land. The planet from above, begins to look different, its surface increasingly patterned with human intention. Still, mysteries remain. Why did these people leave the lands where farming began? And why did they continue ever further into Europe's forests and valleys? Some suggest population pressure in Anatolia and the Balkans forced expansion. Others argue it was opportunity, the search for fertile, unclaimed soils. But the evidence does not tell us everything. It only shows that within a few centuries, a way of life that had defined the Near East for millennia was transplanted to entirely new regions, where rivers ran colder and winters stretched longer. Archaeological layers reveal both continuity and adaptation. In Greece and the Balkans, crops closely resemble those of the Near East. By the time farming reaches Central Europe, however, varieties are changing. Barley begins to dominate in places where wheat fails. Lentils appear less often, replaced by peas and beans more suited to the climate. These adjustments are small but significant. They show a living process of trial, error, and survival. The scale of these migrations is immense. From Anatolia to the Danube is a journey longer than the distance between Paris and Warsaw, yet generation after generation continues the path, not in haste, but with the slow persistence of people following rivers and valley and building homes, raising families, or planting seeds. Their world is no longer the roaming landscape of the Ice Age, but a cultivated patchwork, a mosaic of fields, gardens, and pastures stretching across regions. Even so, farming is not easy. Soil fertility declines without rotation. Wooden tools wear down. Herds require constant tending, and animals are vulnerable to disease. Life expectancy may not have increased compared to hunting and gathering. Skeletal remains show stress on joints, signs of heavy labor, and evidence of nutritional shortfalls. Farming communities carry both promise and hardship. At night, under skies still bright with stars, smoke rises from hearths inside timber houses. Families gather, eat, and rest, while fields lie silent beyond the walls. Dogs guard the perimeters, their bones also found in burials, sometimes treated with care, equal to that of humans. These dogs assist in herding and protect the animals from predators. Their presence, humble yet constant, marks another thread in the weaving of farm life. The first farmers of Europe leave behind evidence of their beliefs as well. Figurines shaped from clay, often female in form, are found buried in house floors or placed in ditches. Their meaning remains unknown. Some scholars see them as symbols of fertility, others as household spirits or teaching tools. The debate continues. What is certain is that alongside fields and houses, ideas also migrate, taking root in unfamiliar ground. Thus begins the story of Europe's earliest farmers. Their villages spread, their crops adapt, and their lives intertwine with both the land and the people already living upon it. The stage is set for centuries of growth, adaptation, and eventually collapse. But for now, the fields of abundance stretch outward, nourished by seeds carried across continents, and by the hope that settled life will endure in a world always shifting. Across Central and Southeastern Europe, the quiet marks of permanence begin to spread, along the banks of the Danube, on open terraces above floodplains, and within the gentle folds of valleys. Farmers raise dwellings unlike any seen before in these lands. They build with timber cut from surrounding forests, anchoring posts deep into the soil, then weaving branches and covering them with clay. These structures, when completed, form long, rectangular houses. Some stretch longer than 30 paces, with carefully aligned walls and pitched roofs of thatch. Step by step, a pattern emerges. Each house is built in line with the next, forming rows or clusters that suggest a sense of order, perhaps even planning. Archaeologists find evidence of paths running between them, compacted by years of footsteps. Around the houses, shallow pits are dug for storage, refuse, or clay extraction. These are filled with broken pottery, discarded tools, and fragments of food waste. To the trained eye, they are records of everyday life, preserved in soil. Inside, hearths burn steadily, leaving blackened patches of earth. Clay ovens sometimes survive, with scorched walls that tell of bread baked and meals cooked. Storage bins hold grain and pulses, while cattle and sheep may be penned nearby. These details, silent yet telling, show that farming has become rooted in place. Unlike the mobile camps of hunter-gatherers, these villages endure. Some last for centuries, rebuilt house upon house, forming mounds of occupation that rise above the surrounding fields. One archaeological fact stands out. The longhouse tradition spreads across vast distances from the Balkans into Central Europe, associated with what later scholars call the linear band ceramic, or LBK, culture. The name comes from the decorated pottery these people make, etched with long curving bands. These ceramics, often used for cooking and storage, survive in fragments scattered across abandoned sites. Their presence provides one of the clearest markers of Europe's first widespread farming culture. Yet, alongside this broad pattern, a lesser-known detail emerges. In some settlements, post holes reveal not just one house, but multiple houses rebuilt in nearly the same location. This suggests continuity, perhaps families returning to the same place generation after generation. It also hints at a deeper attachment to land, an early sense of ownership that farming seems to require. The soil itself becomes a possession, something invested in and defended. As settlements grow, the forests retreat. Farmers cut oak, elm, and hazel to clear fields and to provide timber for their homes. Pollen analysis from ancient lake sediments shows a sharp decline in tree cover during this period. In its place appear traces of cereal pollen, a faint but unmistakable signature of cultivation. From the perspective of the wider planet, Europe is undergoing one of its first large-scale transformations by human hands. Where dense woodland once stretched unbroken, clearings now fragment the canopy, changing habitats for countless plants and animals. Still, mysteries remain in these foundations, Why are the houses so large, often far bigger than required for a single nuclear family? Some researchers argue that they house extended families or clans, reflecting social units larger than we might imagine. Others suggest that their size is symbolic, a statement of permanence and status. The truth is uncertain. No written record exists, only the silent impressions of timbers long decayed. The rhythm of life inside these settlements is marked by cycles of growth and decay. Each house lasts for perhaps a generation, then is abandoned, dismantled, or burned. New houses rise nearby. Over time, this creates a shifting landscape, with clusters of houses scattered across a wider area rather than fixed in one place. Villages breathe, expand, contract, and shift. Another question arises: how do these early farmers organize themselves? There is little evidence of central authority, no palaces, and no monumental architecture. in this early phase. Instead, communities seem to operate on a local scale, each settlement managing its own fields, animals, and households. Yet connections exist. Stone tools made from flint and obsidian, sourced from quarries hundreds of kilometers away, appear in their toolkits. These testify to exchange networks reaching across long distances. Step by step, a continental pattern unfolds, from Anatolia to the Balkans and onward to the Danube and beyond. Similar houses, pottery, and tools appear, always accompanied by fields of cereals and herds of animals. The spread is not uniform. Some regions adopt farming earlier than others, but the trend is clear. Farming is no longer an isolated experiment, but a way of life spanning much of Europe. Burials provide further insight. Within or near the villages, graves are dug, often aligned east to west. Bodies are placed carefully, sometimes with ornaments of shell or bone, sometimes with stone tools. These offerings are modest, but they reveal care for the dead and recognition of identity. In some cemeteries, men, women, and children are all buried together, suggesting a community structure where all members hold value. Yet differences in grave goods hint at emerging distinctions, perhaps wealth, status, or role within the community. One unresolved mystery lingers in these foundations. Some sites show signs of deliberate burning, not just of single houses, but of entire settlements. Were these accidental fires, ritual acts, or hostile attacks? Archaeologists continue to debate the causes, as the evidence of widespread burning adds an element of uncertainty to the otherwise steady rhythm of settlement life. As the centuries pass, the environment continues to change. The climate in this early Holocene epoch is generally favorable, warmer than the Ice Age, but not without fluctuations. Periods of wetter conditions bring floods, while drier spells strain crops and herds. Farming communities must adapt continually. The very success of permanent villages makes them vulnerable to the variability of nature. Scale offers perspective here. A settlement of longhouses might cover only a few hectares, yet, when multiplied across river valleys and plains, the impact is vast. Tens of thousands of people now live in Europe in ways unimaginable to their hunter-gatherer predecessors. The population increases, though slowly. Each cluster of houses represents not just a shelter, but an investment in land, soil, and the cycles of growth that sustain life. In these timber and clay foundations lie both strength and fragility. They represent the first rooted communities of Europe, yet they also depend on delicate balances of soil fertility, rainfall, and cooperation among neighbors. The silent post holes and collapsed walls uncovered today speak of beginnings, of a society learning to anchor itself to place, to time, and to the promise of fields that must yield again and again. For now, the villages stand. Smoke rises from hearths, pottery clinks as meals are prepared, and children play in the open spaces between houses. Across Europe, the experiment of settled life takes hold, fragile yet enduring. These foundations, silent beneath the soil, still shape the landscapes where forests once grew uninterrupted. Across the fields that stretch beyond each longhouse, the rhythm of planting and harvest begins to settle. The air carries the faint smell of smoke from stubble burned after cutting, and the soil bears marks of repeated use. These are the lands of early cereals, wheat, barley, and lentils, carried with care from their ancestral home in the Fertile Crescent. Yet here, far to the northwest of that origin. The plants encounter new skies, harsher winters, and unfamiliar cycles of rain. Step by step, adaptation unfolds. Einkorn and emmer wheat, the earliest domesticated grains, struggle in damp northern soils. In some places they thrive, but in others they fail. Barley proves more resilient. It endures in poor soils, survives cold nights, and matures quickly. Archaeological remains confirm this shift. By the time farming spreads through Central Europe, barley appears with growing frequency, slowly overtaking wheat in some regions. Farmers, knowingly or not, are reshaping their agricultural toolkit, selecting crops that suit their new home. Seeds are not the only companions. Alongside cereals come pulses, lentils, peas, and beans. These provide protein, a vital supplement to the starchy grains. Yet they, too, respond differently to Europe's climate. Lentils, accustomed to drier lands, often vanish from the record, while peas prove more adaptable. Storage pits dug beside houses preserve charred traces of these crops, telling the story of meals long past and the adjustments necessary to keep communities fed. From a planetary perspective, the spread of these plants is remarkable. They cross not only cultural boundaries but climatic zones, moving thousands of kilometers from origin to new soils. Each grain of wheat found in an excavation tells of a journey across landscapes once filled only with wild grasses. The expansion of agriculture alters the natural cycles of vegetation, introducing species into regions where they never grew before. One lesser-known detail emerges from the study of weeds. Alongside ancient cereals, seeds of wild plants appear in archaeological samples, charred remains preserved accidentally in hearths and ovens. These weeds reveal information beyond the crops themselves. Some are species typical of disturbed soils, indicating fields tilled repeatedly. Others are plants of drier ground, suggesting shifting cultivation or seasonal variation. The weeds tell of labor, of women and men pulling them from the soil, of efforts to protect precious crops, of a struggle repeated year after year. Still, mysteries remain. How did early farmers preserve enough seed for planting each spring while also feeding their families? Without careful storage, grain rots, molds, or is eaten by pests. Archaeological evidence of clay-lined pits and woven baskets hints at solutions, yet the reliability of these methods remains debated. Did poor storage sometimes lead to famine? The record is silent, but the risk must have been real. The seasonal cycle of farming life requires careful timing. Seeds must be sown at the right moment, often in autumn, to take advantage of winter moisture. Harvest must follow before storms arrive, or crops will rot. This calendar imposes a new discipline on human life. No longer entirely free to move with the game or fruiting trees, communities are bound to the rhythm of the fields. Their survival depends on observation, patience, and luck. Beyond the fields, herds graze, sheep and goats browse on cleared land, their dung enriching soils but their hooves compacting it. Cattle provide traction, though true ploughing is not yet practiced. They also yield milk, though whether early farmers consume dairy widely is still debated. Genetic evidence suggests that at this stage, most people cannot digest lactose in adulthood. If milk is used, it may be processed into cheese or yogurt, which reduces its lactose content. Clay sieves found in some settlements may have served this purpose, silent witnesses of early dairying. The presence of livestock adds further complexity to farming. Animals must be kept safe through the winter, requiring fodder. They compete with humans for stored grain. yet they also offer meat and hides when slaughtered. Their bones, found in middens and pits, tell of both routine butchery and occasional feasts. Farming life is not only about fields of grain, but about the integration of plants and animals in a fragile balance. From the viewpoint of the wider continent, farming spreads unevenly. In some valleys it takes root quickly, villages flourishing with abundant crops. In others it stalls, slowed by poor soils, harsh winters, or resistance from local hunter-gatherers. Genetic studies show that intermarriage occurs, blending the ancestries of farmers and foragers. This mixing may bring new knowledge, hunters sharing the secrets of wild foods, farmers teaching cultivation. Yet the process is not uniform. In some places, even the two groups remain separate for centuries. A question lingers: how did early farmers cope with failure? A bad harvest could mean hunger, especially for communities less able to rely on wild resources. Archaeological layers sometimes reveal sudden breaks, villages abandoned, storage pits emptied, houses left to rot. Whether these collapses result from famine, disease, or social stress remains uncertain. Each case is a mystery, a silent reminder that farming was never guaranteed success. The scale of cultivation grows nonetheless. By the middle of the 6th millennium before the present era, farming communities extend across much of Central Europe. Their fields, though modest in size, represent a vast change in land use. Each cleared hectare displaces forest, alters soil, and reshapes the local ecosystem. From above, the continent now bears scars of human intention. Faint lines of fields etched into landscapes once dominated by oak and elm. These new rhythms of life also alter the human body. Skeletal remains show signs of repetitive strain, knees and backs worn from bending and lifting, teeth ground down by coarse bread mixed with stone fragments from grinding tools. Yet bones also reveal growth, populations increase, children are born in greater numbers, and communities endure across generations. Farming, though demanding, sustains more people than hunting alone. In the quiet of evening, after fields lie bare from harvest, communities gather, pottery vessels, decorated with bands and lines, hold meals of grain porridge, stew, or bread. The air carries the scent of cooking, the crackle of fire, the murmur of voices. These scenes are imagined from fragments, from charred grains, worn tools, broken pots, yet together they form a picture of continuity, of people living within a pattern, both new and enduring. Thus, the seeds carried on distant winds take root. They adapt to unfamiliar climates. They falter and recover. They shape the rhythms of human life. In their success lies the foundation of Europe's first farming societies. In their fragility lies the shadow of the collapse yet to come. For now, the fields stretch outward, green in spring, golden in summer, stubbled in autumn, bare in winter, waiting, always, for the cycle to begin again. Beneath the soil of Europe's first villages lies another kind of record, one written not in timber or clay, but in bone. When settlements endure for decades, they accumulate burials. Graves appear within houses, beneath floors, or clustered in small cemeteries nearby. Each one preserves details of a life once lived, and together they form a window into the health, diets, and struggles of early farming communities. Step by step, archaeologists uncover these remains. Carefully brushed and measured, they reveal patterns otherwise hidden. The bones of adults show wear from hard labor, knees compressed, spines curved from bending, joints eroded by years of carrying and lifting. Farming is demanding, requiring tasks repeated daily: tilling, weeding, grinding grain, hauling water. These traces are etched into the skeletons, silent testimony to the cost of settled life. Teeth add another dimension. Microscopic scratches and chips record diets heavy in coarse bread and porridge. Stone fragments from grinding tools often mix into flour, wearing enamel down to roots. Cavities also increase, for cereals carry more starch than the varied foods of hunter-gatherers. Children's teeth sometimes show lines of interrupted growth, markers of illness or malnutrition during their early years. Farming communities may support more people, but they also face new vulnerabilities in diet and health. From a broader perspective, isotopic analysis, chemical signatures preserved in bone, tells of what these people ate. Farmers consume diets richer in cereals and domestic animals, yet lower in diverse wild foods. Compared to hunter-gatherers buried nearby, their chemistry differs, revealing a narrowing of nutritional range. This narrowing sustains population growth, but it also increases reliance on a few crops, a fragile base for survival. A lesser-known detail appears in some graves: beads made of seashells, carried from coasts hundreds of kilometers away, rest beside the dead. These ornaments, modest in size, hint at networks of exchange that extend far beyond the village. They also suggest meaning, adornment, identity, perhaps memory of distant places. Even in death, people are connected to landscapes they never walked. Yet mysteries remain. In some cemeteries, large numbers of infants are buried, far more than expected. Scholars debate why. Was child mortality unusually high? Did diseases strike communities with particular severity? Or do these burials reflect cultural practices, infants interred in places archaeologists have not yet found? The truth is uncertain, and the silence of the record leaves many questions unanswered. The arrangement of graves also reveals subtle structures. In some sites, bodies are placed with care, aligned consistently, suggesting ritual or shared belief. In others, patterns are less clear, with burials scattered or overlapping. Grave goods vary too. Some individuals are buried with polished stone axes or decorated pottery, while others rest with little or nothing. This variation may reflect emerging differences in status, roles, or wealth. Farming, by producing surpluses, allows inequality to appear, though on a modest scale compared to later ages. Planetary forces play a role here as well. As glaciers continue to retreat, Europe's landscapes open to new vegetation, animals, and diseases. Farming communities, by living in close quarters with animals, encounter pathogens once limited to wild herds. Bones sometimes show lesions consistent with infections, though exact diagnoses are uncertain. The very success of village life brings risks unknown to roaming bands of foragers. Burial practices also show evidence of changing relationships with land. Hunter-gatherer graves are often located near rivers or prominent natural features, but farmers increasingly bury their dead within or beside their settlements. This suggests a deepening attachment to place, as if ancestors anchor the living to the soil they cultivate. Each grave reinforces continuity, binding families not just to each other, but to the fields that feed them. Still, questions linger. In some abandoned villages, few burials are found. Did people move their dead when they left? Or were remains lost to erosion and decay? Or were some deaths treated in ways that left no archaeological trace? The absence is as telling as the presence. Silence, too, can be a record. Skeletal studies reveal more than hardship. They also show resilience. Healed fractures demonstrate survival after injury, care given by others, and the capacity of communities to sustain their members. Teeth worn smooth yet intact suggest diets managed across decades. Burials of the elderly, rare among hunter-gatherers, become more common, indicating that settled life, though difficult, allows some to reach advanced age. Scale offers perspective. A cemetery with 50 burials may seem small, yet it represents generations of lives within a single village. Multiply this across hundreds of settlements, and Europe in the 6th millennium before the present era becomes a continent increasingly shaped by the presence and memory of farming peoples. Their bones, now studied in laboratories, are fragments of that vast human story. One unresolved mystery surrounds violence. Some burials show signs of trauma, fractured skulls, broken ribs, arrow points lodged in bone. Were these the result of conflict between groups, raids from hunter-gatherers, or accidents in daily labor? The evidence is ambiguous. In some cases, healed injuries suggest community violence survived and endured. In others, mass graves point to more sudden and devastating events. These themes will surface again in the centuries to follow. For now, the graves tell of continuity. They show communities that endure long enough to bury generation after generation. They record the shift from wild to cultivated diets, from mobility to permanence, from shared landscapes to fixed territories. They capture both the promise and the burden of farming life. As evening falls over reconstructed villages in the imagination, one can picture the stillness, houses standing in rows, fields lying beyond, and beneath the ground, ancestors resting in silence, the living walk above them, their daily tasks shaped by the same soil that holds the dead. This intertwining of life, labor, and memory defines Europe's first farming communities. Thus, in bones and soil, in ornaments of shell and beads of stone, the record of Europe's first farmers deepens. Their prosperity is fragile, their health compromised, yet their presence spreads. The foundation of later history is here, fragile but enduring, marked by burials that preserve their story in fragments of bone and earth. Across the wide forests of early Holocene Europe, change begins to move slowly but with lasting effect. The continent that for millennia had been covered in dense woodland now starts to carry clearings. Oaks, elms, hazels, and lindens once formed unbroken canopies stretching from river valley to mountain foothill. In these forests, wolves, aurochs, and red deer roamed in herds. Beavers shaped waterways, and wild boar rooted through undergrowth. Yet with the arrival of farming villages, the balance begins to shift. Step by step, families take stone axes and fire to the trees. Each longhouse requires timber beams, sometimes a dozen meters long, to support its roof. Each field requires space where once there was shade. Cutting and burning become routine tasks. Archaeologists trace this process not only through charred wood, but also through pollen. Lake sediments, sampled and examined under microscopes, show sudden declines in tree pollen, especially elm. In its place appear cereal grains and the pollen of weeds that thrive in disturbed ground. This transformation is visible at the planetary scale. For the first time since the glaciers retreated, humans reshape European ecosystems in ways lasting and extensive. While earlier hunter-gatherers used fire to open meadows, their impact was scattered. Farming creates systematic clearing, repeated across regions. The land begins to show human design, even when viewed from far above. A lesser-known detail emerges in this story of clearing. At some sites, archaeologists find polished stone axes deposited in bogs or rivers. These tools, finely made and laboriously ground, were capable of felling large trees. Yet many are left unused, placed deliberately in watery places. Scholars debate their meaning. Were they offerings to spirits of water or earth, gratitude for fertile land, or were they discarded when no longer usable? The mystery endures, but the pattern suggests symbolism bound to the very tools that shape forests into fields. As the forests recede, new habitats arise. Open land encourages grazing animals, both domestic and wild. Deer feed at the edges of clearings. Birds adapted to meadows spread. Weeds, once rare, begin to flourish. Humans are not the only beneficiaries of this shift. Entire ecosystems reorganize around the new mosaic of forest and field. Yet some species decline. Beavers vanish where rivers are settled, their dams no longer tolerated. Aurochs, the great wild cattle, retreat as their ranges shrink and domestic herds dominate. The balance of life is altered. Mysteries still surround the pace and scale of this change. Some pollen records suggest that elm decline across Europe may not be solely due to human clearing, but to disease, similar to the elm diseases of modern times. Was it coincidence that elm trees died back just as farming expanded? Or did both processes reinforce one another? Archaeologists and paleobotanists continue to debate this. The record offers clues but no final answers. The clearing of land also reshapes human society. Fields require boundaries. Fences of wood or hedges of brush mark the edges, protecting crops from animals. Paths connect fields to villages, worn into the soil by generations of footsteps. Ditches appear, dug for drainage or for marking territory. These features reveal that farming is not only an economic act but also a social one. Land becomes defined, divided, and defended. From the perspective of scale, the change is immense. A single village might clear a few hectares each year, but across hundreds of villages, the total adds up. By the middle of the 6th millennium before the present era, Central Europe is no longer a solid forest but a patchwork. Strips of cleared soil stretch outward from rivers, linked by paths, dotted with longhouses. Forest remains, but its dominance is broken. Still, farming life depends on the forest even as it pushes it back. Timber supplies fuel for hearths, wood for tools, branches for fences. Wild foods are gathered still, berries, nuts, and honey, and hunting continues in surrounding woods. But the balance is not absolute replacement, but integration. Farmers both use and resist the forest, shaping it to their needs while relying on its resources. Archaeological remains show how deeply forests intertwine with farming technology. Stone axes, adzes, and chisels all bear the polish of heavy use. Grinding stones are made from boulders collected in forested riverbeds. Pottery is tempered with crushed stone and sometimes plant fibers gathered nearby. Even the thatch for roofs is harvested from meadows opened by clearing. Every material link ties the village to its environment, yet transforms that environment in return. A question lingers in these landscapes. How sustainable was this process? Could soil fertility last when fields were cultivated year after year without rotation. Some evidence suggests shifting cultivation, fields used for a decade, then left fallow as new ground was cleared. This pattern spreads the impact but also demands continuous expansion. Villages may have moved when local resources were exhausted, leaving behind silent traces in the forest. Planetary cycles influence these local choices. The Holocene climate is generally warm, but variations in rainfall create years of abundance followed by years of stress. Forests cut too widely may fail to regenerate, leaving soil exposed to erosion. Fields abandoned may revert to scrub, but not to the dense woodland of earlier centuries. Human presence has begun to alter long-term ecological trajectories. One unresolved mystery lies in the appearance of large enclosures. In some regions, wide ditches encircle areas larger than villages themselves. Their purpose is debated. Were they communal gathering places, ritual centers, or defenses? Clearing forest for such vast spaces required immense labor. Whatever their function, they show that human transformation of landscapes extended beyond mere subsistence. Symbol and society also demanded open ground. At night, the boundary between forest and clearing takes on another meaning. Wolves and bears still roam Europe. Farmers light fires at the edges of their villages, the glow visible across the stubbled fields. Animals move cautiously, while humans remain watchful. These moments reflect a world not yet tamed, where farming communities live within a wider wilderness, their survival dependent on fragile balances. Thus, the forests pushed back become both a resource and a memory. Each tree cut and each field planted represents both gain and loss. The quiet canopies that once covered Europe are reshaped into open mosaics. The first farmers leave a mark deeper than their houses or potsherds. They begin the slow, enduring transformation of entire ecosystems. For now, the villages stand firm within their clearings. Smoke rises through evening air, fields stretch outward, and beyond the horizon the forest waits, vast and dark. Europe's first farmers live between these worlds, of woodland and of field, reshaping both, even as mysteries of cause and consequence remain hidden in the soil and pollen of their time. Beyond the clearings of each village, connections begin to stretch outward. Farming life is not lived in isolation. Though houses stand in rows and fields cluster around rivers, people seek what their own land cannot provide. Stone, shells, and ornaments move along paths that link one community to another, forming early networks of exchange across Europe. Step by step, archaeologists trace these routes. In settlements hundreds of kilometers apart, identical objects appear. Polished stone axes of rare greenstone, sourced from alpine quarries, turn up in distant river valleys. Obsidian, a volcanic glass sharp as a razor, travels from mountain sources in Anatolia and Hungary into Central Europe. Even seashell, carried from Mediterranean and Atlantic shores, arrive in inland graves, far from the ocean's edge. These artifacts are rare, but they reveal movement, not just of materials but of ideas, contacts, and obligations. One historical fact stands out. The linear band ceramic farmers of Central Europe relied heavily on flint tools for daily work. Yet not all flint is alike. Some sources produce superior, fine-grained stone, ideal for blades. Archaeological evidence shows large-scale quarrying of flint, with deep pits and heaps of discarded rock, far beyond the needs of local villages. These quarries become centers of production, supplying tools carried along exchange routes that span hundreds of kilometers. a lesser-known detail emerges in these networks. Alongside stone, archaeologists discover small ornaments, beads made from spondylus shell, a bright red species found in the warm waters of the Aegean. These shells, cut and polished into pendants, appear in graves far inland. Their presence suggests not mere utility but symbolism. They may have been markers of status, tokens of distant connection, or even elements of ritual. Whatever their meaning, they show that farmers valued more than survival. They sought beauty, rarity, and the power of objects from far places. Yet mysteries surround the mechanics of exchange. Did villages send emissaries along these routes? Or did objects pass hand to hand, village to village, across generations? Was there trade in the modern sense, or was exchange bound to marriage, ritual, or alliancing? The archaeological record cannot fully answer. What is clear is that Europe's first farmers, though rooted in place, were linked through webs of contact extending across vast landscapes. From a planetary perspective, these networks matter. They allow not only materials but also ideas and practices to spread. Pottery styles, house-building methods, and farming techniques move along with beads and axes. In this way, cultural traditions stretch across rivers and mountains, knitting scattered villages into a wider horizon of shared knowledge. The spread of farming itself relies on such connections, each new region adopting practices tested and carried from elsewhere. Still, these links are fragile. Exchange depends on trust, reciprocity, and routes free from danger. If relations sour or violence interrupts paths, villages may be cut off from supplies of vital stone or ornaments that carry meaning within their communities. Archaeological layers show both continuity and interruption, suggesting that networks wax and wane with time. One unresolved mystery lies in the role of these exchanges in social hierarchy. Did possession of rare shells or axes elevate some families above others? Some burials suggest so, with certain individuals interred with multiple ornaments or finely made tools, while others receive little. Yet the scale of inequality seems modest compared to later ages. Farming villages appear relatively egalitarian, though differences in wealth and influence are beginning to emerge. The movement of objects also raises questions of memory. A shell bead buried hundreds of kilometers from the sea carries with it a story of hands that passed it along, of landscapes crossed, of rivers followed. Each rare object is not just material, but narrative, a trace of human connection woven into the fabric of farming life. Scale helps place these exchanges in context. To carry obsidian from Anatolia into Central Europe is to move across distances as great as those between Paris and Budapest. Such journeys, whether by single travelers or by many intermediaries, represent extraordinary links across the continent. In a world without roads or beasts of burden beyond cattle, such distances emphasize the determination and persistence of these early networks. Another question lingers. Were these exchanges primarily peaceful, or did they sometimes provoke tension? Valuable objects might inspire envy or conflict. The rarity of some materials could spark disputes, though the evidence is scarce. Archaeologists uncover signs of violence in some settlements, but whether linked to trade or to other causes remains uncertain. The shadows of these networks hold both promise and risk. At night, in villages scattered across river valleys, the presence of exotic objects may have carried weight in gatherings around the hearth. A polished axe from distant stone, gleaming in firelight, could speak of connections beyond the horizon. A shell pendant worn on a cord could remind its owner of journeys never taken but imagined. In these ways, objects were not inert but active participants in human thought, memory, and identity. For now, the paths remain open. People walk them slowly, carrying baskets of grain, bundles of stone, or ornaments of shell. Rivers guide their movement, mountains challenge it, and forests obscure the way. Yet step by step, objects move, and with them, the threads of Europe's first networks are woven. These paths of exchange, fragile yet enduring, bind villages together across a continent still dominated by forest and field. Even as villages multiply across river valleys and plains, the old ways do not vanish. For thousands of years before farming, Europe's landscapes were the realm of hunter-gatherers. They followed rivers for fish, tracked herds across forests, and gathered nuts, berries, and roots through the turning seasons. When farmers arrive, these older traditions endure, adapting slowly, resisting in some places, blending in others. The story of Europe's first farmers is also the story of those who lived beside them. Archaeological layers reveal the overlap. In caves, foragers continue to leave traces of hearths, stone tools, and hunted game, even as nearby valleys fill with longhouses. At lake shores, fishing camps remain active. The bones of sturgeon, pike, and salmon tell of continuity in watery landscapes. Shell middens grow on coastlines, piles of discarded shells marking places where families return generation after generation. Farming does not erase these patterns overnight. Instead, the two ways of life coexist. One historical fact is clear from genetic studies. In many regions, the ancestry of later Europeans reflects both farmers and foragers. Farming communities arrive carrying Anatolian ancestry, yet their descendants show admixture with local hunter-gatherers. The blending is uneven. Some groups remain isolated for centuries, while others intermarry quickly. This genetic mosaic suggests that farming spread not only through migration, but also through integration. The old ways persisted within new ones. A lesser-known detail lies in the persistence of wild foods. Even in farming villages, charred remains of hazelnuts, acorns, and wild fruits appear in storage pits. Hunting also continues. Deer antlers, used as tools or ornaments, are common. Farmers still rely on surrounding forests, supplementing their diets with familiar resources. This blending of strategies suggests flexibility, an insurance against the risk of failed harvests. Farming communities are not wholly divorced from foraging, but remain entangled with it. Yet mysteries surround the nature of interaction. Were relations between farmers and foragers peaceful, hostile, or shifting with time? Some archaeological evidence points to coexistence. Shared campsites, hybrid toolkits, and mixed diets suggest cooperation and exchange. In other contexts, signs of conflict appear: burned villages, trauma on skeletons, defensive ditches surrounding settlements. The truth may vary from valley to valley. Some groups integrate, others resist, and still others withdraw deeper into forests and mountains. From the perspective of the wider planet, this coexistence reflects human adaptability. Farming is not inevitable, nor does it immediately dominate. Foragers persist for centuries, adjusting their strategies to a continent increasingly reshaped by fields and herds. Some coastal groups rely so heavily on marine resources that farming offers little advantage. Others adopt a mixed economy, combining crops with hunting and gathering. The diversity of responses shows that human lifeways are never uniform, but always flexible. An unresolved question concerns identity. Did foragers and farmers see themselves as distinct peoples, or did they share rituals, beliefs, and stories? Archaeological evidence of hybrid practices, pottery decorated with forager motifs, or stone tools in farming context suggests cultural blending, yet the silence of prehistory leaves much unknown. How they spoke of one another, whether as neighbors, rivals, or kin, remains hidden. Scale provides perspective. To move from one farming village to the next might require a day's walk. Between them, forests and rivers held communities of foragers whose lives continued along older rhythms. The landscape of 6th millennium Europe was thus a patchwork, not only of fields and woods, but also of ways of life. To the north and west, foragers endured even longer, their traditions continuing well into later millennia. Farming spread widely, but its edges were blurred. Archaeologists studying isotopes in human bones find further evidence of these blurred edges. Some individuals in farming cemeteries showed diets rich in fish, unusual for settled agriculturalists, hinting at forager ancestry or habits retained within farming life. Likewise, in forager graves, beads of shell and pottery fragments from farming cultures appear. These exchanges suggest porous boundaries, where ideas and objects cross even if lifeways differ. Another question lingers: why did some forager groups eventually adopt farming while others did not? Was it necessity, driven by resource decline as farmers cleared forests and reduced game populations? Or was it choice, drawn by the stability of stored grain and the security of larger communities? The evidence suggests multiple answers. Some groups merge, others resist for centuries. Farming spread is not uniform conquest, but a slow, uneven process of negotiation. At night, in farming villages, smoke drifts upward from hearths, while in nearby forests, foragers light their own fires. Two ways of life exist side by side, sharing the same stars above. Each group looks outward at landscapes filled with opportunity and risk, each relying on skills honed over generations. Their coexistence is not a simple transition, but a dialogue between past and future, between mobility and settlement, between wild and cultivated. For now, both endure. Farmers expand, clearing more fields, building more houses. Foragers continue, following rivers, hunting deer, and gathering nuts. Their paths cross in trade, in conflict, in marriage. The traces of these encounters lie scattered in the soil, a shard of pottery in a forager camp, a deer antler in a farming pit, a genome bearing ancestry from both. Together they form the mosaic of Europe's deep past. Thus, the old ways endure even as new ones spread. Farming may reshape landscapes, but foraging persists, adapting to the changes and contributing to the unfolding story. The coexistence of these worlds, their entanglement and eventual blending, sets the stage for the next chapters of Europe's early history, where climate, disease, and conflict will test the resilience of both traditions. Over the centuries, the farming villages of early Europe thrive, yet they live under skies that never remain entirely steady. Each season carries the promise of growth, but also the threat of failure. Crops sprout in spring, fields glow gold in summer, and granaries fill in autumn. But these cycles are fragile. Beyond the villages, the planet shifts. Ice sheets that once dominated the north continue to melt, Seas rise, and winds alter their paths. Rain falls too much in some years, too little in others. Farmers, bound to soil and season, feel these changes more sharply than foragers ever did. Step by step, the evidence of shifting climate appears in the record. Lake sediments reveal alternating layers of pollen, cereal grains in one band, wild plants in the next, marking years when fields faltered and forests began to return. Tree rings show seasons of drought, with narrow growth lines pressed together, then bursts of recovery when rains return. Stalagmites in caves preserve chemical signals of rainfall, recording centuries of fluctuation. When archaeologists compare these data, a picture emerges of instability. Farming life was never lived under constant skies. One clear historical fact stands out. Around 6,200 years before the present, the planet experiences a sudden cooling. Temperatures drop, rainfall shifts, and in many regions winters grow harsher. This 8.2 kilo-year event, named by scientists, is one of the most abrupt climatic changes of the Holocene. Across Europe, some farming settlements shrink or are abandoned. Fields once fertile may have failed, forcing families to move or to seek new strategies. Archaeology captures only fragments of this story, but the pattern is clear. Climate pressed hard upon these early communities. A lesser-known detail emerges from the study of rivers. In Central Europe, waterways that once meandered gently begin to behave differently during these climatic swings. Some floodplains widen suddenly, covering fields with layers of silt. Other rivers shrink, leaving villages stranded far from reliable water. At certain sites, layers of sand and gravel rest directly atop abandoned house floors, silent witnesses of floods that overwhelmed entire settlements. These traces, subtle yet powerful, show how intimately farming life was tied to the moods of rivers. Mysteries remain about the human response. Some villages vanish almost overnight, while others endure for centuries in the same landscapes. Did climate alone dictate survival, or did conflict, disease, and social strain magnify the stresses? Archaeology offers no definitive answers. Burned houses, empty storage pits, and scattered bones suggest multiple possibilities. What is certain is that nature's shifts set the stage for hardship, and communities had to adapt or dissolve. From the perspective of the planet, these challenges are linked to distant forces. The retreat of glaciers in North America and Greenland disrupts ocean currents, altering rainfall thousands of kilometers away. Farmers in Europe, unaware of these distant causes, experience them only as failed harvests, hungry winters, or waters that rise unexpectedly. Their world is local, yet their fate is shaped by global systems. An unresolved question lies in the persistence of farming during these climatic challenges. In some regions, farming expands even as others decline. Along northern coasts, new settlements appear despite harsher conditions. Did migrating families carry their crops into fresh territories, seeking more favorable soils? Or did foragers in those regions adopt farming techniques precisely when old resources became less reliable? The record is uneven, leaving open the question of whether adversity spread or spurred farming practices. The effects on human bodies are visible. Bones of children show growth lines that pause during seasons of malnutrition, resuming only when food recovers. Isotope analysis suggests dietary stress, with less protein and more reliance on cereals during poor years. Some cemeteries record higher mortality rates coinciding with known climatic downturns. Farming may have allowed more people to be fed in good times, but it made them more vulnerable in bad ones. Yet adaptation appears. Barley, more tolerant of poor soils and drought, becomes increasingly important. Peas and beans, which restore nitrogen to the soil, enter fields alongside cereals. Herders adjust as well, relying more heavily on animals when grain fails. Hunters return to forests, supplementing diets with deer, boar, and wild berries. Flexibility allows many communities to weather instability, though not all succeed. Scale offers perspective. A decade of drought might devastate a single valley, yet across the continent, other regions prosper. The spread of farming is patchy, reflecting both local climates and human strategies. This unevenness explains why farming persists, though some villages vanish, others take root, and the overall presence of agriculture across Europe continues to grow. The memory of instability leaves cultural marks. Pottery styles shift, suggesting new identities or alliances formed during hardship. Figurines and decorated vessels proliferate, hinting at ritual attempts to understand or appease forces beyond control. In some sites, deposits of animal bones in large pits suggest feasting or sacrifice, perhaps ceremonies to restore balance. The details are uncertain, but the persistence of symbolic practice shows that communities responded to climate not only with labor, but with meaning. Still, mysteries endure. Were these rituals communal acts of solidarity, or signs of growing division as groups sought different solutions? Archaeology offers fragments, broken vessels, burned bones, patterned deposits. Interpretations vary, but all suggest that farming life was not only about soil and seed, but also about belief, woven into cycles of uncertainty. At night, after long days in fields stressed by weather, families may have watched clouds with unease. A dry spring could spell hunger by autumn. A flood could undo months of work in a single day. Their lives were bound to patterns they could not control. Yet they continued, sowing again, hoping for balance, adapting with each turn of the season. Thus, the rise and struggle of Europe's first farmers is inseparable from the wider forces of the earth. The waters rise, the skies shift, and fragile communities bend beneath the weight of change. Some collapse, others endure, all leaving behind traces of resilience and fragility. These cycles of abundance and scarcity foreshadow the deeper challenges yet to come, when not only nature but also disease, isolation, and conflict will shape the destiny of Europe's first farming societies. In the quiet layers of Europe's soil, archaeologists uncover a recurring pattern. Villages that once thrived with smoke rising from hearths, with fields spreading outward from their edges, suddenly fall silent. Longhouses collapse into piles of charred timber. Storage pits stand empty, their clay linings cracked and dry. Fields once cultivated return to weeds and young trees. The evidence suggests abandonment, sometimes gradual, but often sudden, as if entire communities departed within a short span of time. Step by step, the story unfolds. Excavations across Central Europe reveal houses deserted while still intact. Roof beams collapse inward, preserved by fire or decay. Tools remain scattered on floors. Pottery sits broken where it fell. Unlike the mobile camps of hunter-gatherers, where movement left little trace, these villages leave behind a haunting stillness, the impression of lives interrupted. One clear archaeological fact is the widespread occurrence of such abandoned sites. The linear band ceramic culture, which dominated Central Europe during the 6th millennium before the present era, leaves behind hundreds of villages, Yet many of these settlements are deserted after only a few generations. Archaeologists map these patterns across river valleys, noting sequences of foundation, flourishing, and sudden decline. The rhythm of settlement is not steady growth but cycles of rise and disappearance. A lesser-known detail lies in the weeds that reclaim these places. Soil samples from abandoned villages contain seeds of wild plants, nettles, goosefoot, and thistles, species that thrive in disturbed ground left untended. Within a decade of abandonment, weeds flourish in former fields. Within a century, young forest begins to return. Nature quickly reclaims what humans leave behind. The resilience of woodland is evident in pollen records, where tree species reappear soon after farmers depart. Yet mysteries surround the causes of abandonment. Were these villages deserted because of exhausted soils, unable to sustain crops after years of continuous cultivation? Some evidence suggests that fields were overused, fertility declining without rotation or replenishment. Others point to disease, spreading rapidly in crowded settlements. Still others argue for conflict, with attacks forcing communities to flee. The evidence varies from site to site, leaving no single answer. From the perspective of the wider planet, these abandonments coincide with climatic instability. Periods of drought or flooding may have made certain locations untenable. A flood could wipe out a season's harvest, forcing relocation. A series of dry years could leave granaries empty, prompting migration. The interplay of local soil conditions and global climate cycles may have driven the rhythm of abandonment. Archaeologists also consider social factors. Villages may have fractured internally, disputes over land or resources leading groups to leave and found new settlements. The very permanence of farming life, tied to fixed fields, may have made communities more vulnerable to conflict than mobile foragers. Defensive ditches around some settlements hint at fear, protection, and perhaps siege. Yet whether these ditches guarded against neighbors or symbolized boundaries remains debated. An unresolved mystery lies in the fate of those who left. Did they move to nearby valleys, founding new villages? Did they join other communities already established? Or did some return to foraging, abandoning fields for forests? The record is silent on these choices. What is clear is that people rarely vanish entirely. Their lives continue elsewhere, though the places they leave behind appear as ruins to us. Scale offers perspective on these patterns. A single village might endure for 60 years before being abandoned. Multiply this across hundreds of sites. And Central Europe in the 6th millennium appears not as a static landscape, but as one of constant motion. Villages emerge, grow, collapse, and reappear elsewhere. Farming spreads, but its footprint shifts continually. Abandonment is not the end of farming, but part of its rhythm. In some cases, archaeologists uncover signs of deliberate burning. Whole houses, even entire settlements, appear to have been set alight at the moment of departure. Were these ritual closures, acts of cleansing before moving on, or evidence of violence? Raids that destroyed villages and drove survivors away. The blackened timbers remain, but their meaning is uncertain. The silence of millennia leaves only traces, not explanations. From the human perspective, the experience must have been profound. To walk away from a longhouse built with effort, from fields cleared by generations, meant abandoning more than shelter. It meant leaving behind ancestors buried nearby, memories tied to place, and investments of labor. Yet families did so repeatedly. Farming life was rooted in soil, but not immovable. Communities adapted by shifting when needed, even at great cost. One unresolved question concerns the emotional weight of these departures. Did people view abandonment as failure, as necessity, or as renewal? Archaeology cannot answer. What remains are the material traces. Ditches filled with weeds, hearths gone cold, and timbers collapsed into earth. And these are landscapes of absence, where silence speaks more than artifacts. At night, after abandonment, forests slowly reclaim the ground. Owls nest in the rafters of fallen roofs. Foxes prowl along paths once trodden by children. Wind scatters seeds across empty fields. The stillness that follows human departure is not empty, but filled with the quiet return of nature. To the planet, the collapse of a village is a brief pause, a rebalancing of soil and forest. To humans, it is the loss of a world built by hand. Thus, the abandoned houses stand as reminders of farming's fragility. Settled life is not a steady line of progress, but a cycle of growth and decline, of villages rising and falling. The empty fields and collapsed timbers tell a story as important as that of flourishing settlements. They remind us that Europe's first farmers lived within delicate balances of soil, water, climate, and community, balances that could tip suddenly, leaving silence where there was life. In the layers of Europe's early farming sites, archaeologists uncover traces that do not fit the quiet rhythm of daily life. Alongside ordinary burials, where individuals rest in carefully prepared graves, there are other, darker discoveries. Pits filled with multiple skeletons, bones marked with cuts and fractures, entire enclosures burned until only charred earth remains. These fragments suggest that life in the first farming villages, though often steady and routine, was sometimes torn apart by conflict. Step by step, the evidence becomes clear. At Talheim in present-day Germany, excavators uncovered a pit containing more than 30 bodies. Men, women, and children lay together, many with skulls fractured by blunt weapons. No care was taken to arrange them. They appear to have been killed quickly and buried hastily. At Schletz in Austria, skeletal remains fill the ditches surrounding a village. Arrowheads pierce ribs and skulls. Many of the dead were left exposed, their bones weathered by sun and scavengers. These scenes, frozen in the soil, reveal violence on a scale that must have shocked entire communities. One historical fact stands out. The linear band ceramic culture, the first great farming society of Central Europe, repeatedly shows evidence of violence. Defensive ditches ring some settlements. Human bones bear marks of trauma from axes, clubs, and arrows. In too many cases, these injuries are not isolated accidents but collective events. Violence was not the norm of daily life, but it was a recurring threat that shaped how people built, lived, and remembered. A lesser-known detail lies in the pattern of wounds. At several mass graves, blows strike the back of the skull, suggesting execution or ambush rather than open combat. Children and women are among the dead, showing that entire communities, not just warriors, were attacked. Some skeletons lack hands or feet, perhaps removed in violence or ritual. These details reveal that conflict in early farming Europe was not only about fighting, but also about sending messages, terrifying survivors, and reshaping landscapes of memory. Yet mysteries remain. Why did these clashes erupt? Scholars debate whether the root was competition for fertile land, cycles of revenge between neighboring groups, or social strain within growing communities. Farming ties people to fixed plots, making disputes over boundaries inevitable. Grain and livestock represent wealth that can be stolen. Villages, once established, become targets for envy or retaliation. But the archaeological record offers no single cause. Each site tells only of outcome, not of motive. From a planetary perspective, conflict must also be viewed against the backdrop of environmental stress. Climate fluctuations, like the abrupt cooling around 6,200 years before present, may have strained resources. In times of poor harvest, neighbors might become rivals. A drought or flood could push one village to raid another. Farming, though productive, created vulnerability, surpluses to defend, shortages to endure. The permanence of villages, surrounded by ditches and houses, made them both strongholds and traps. One unresolved question is whether these violent episodes were exceptional disasters or recurring features of life. Massacres like Talheim and Schletz are rare in the record, but their dramatic nature leaves a lasting impression. Were most villages relatively peaceful, punctuated by rare attacks? Or was violence more common, hidden from view in sites where bones have not survived? Archaeologists cannot yet be certain. What is clear is that when violence occurred, it could wipe out whole communities. Scale offers perspective. A massacre of 30 individuals may seem small, yet in a village of perhaps 100, it represented devastation, the loss of families, leaders, and children in a single event could end a settlement's existence. Survivors might flee, abandoning fields and longhouses. The cycle of village foundation, growth, and sudden abandonment may owe as much to violence as to soil exhaustion or climate. Defensive structures underscore this tension. Around some settlements, archaeologists uncover wide ditches and palisades built with immense labor. These features might have served multiple purposes: drainage, boundaries, or fortifications. But in contexts where skeletons lie in the ditches themselves, their role as defenses is undeniable. Communities invested effort to guard themselves, suggesting that the threat of attack was a lived reality. At night, in longhouses clustered within such enclosures, the atmosphere may have mixed routine with unease. Fires at the edge of clearings lit the dark, serving both as protection against animals and as warnings to watchful neighbors. Dogs barked at noises beyond the fence. Families huddled inside, aware that danger could come not only from hunger or disease, but also from human hands. Farming tied them to the soil, but it also tied them to the risks of defending it. Still, violence was not the only thread binding communities. Exchange networks carried ornaments, axes, and shells across long distances. Marriage linked families in distant valleys. Farming villages were capable of both cooperation and conflict, sometimes within the same generation. The dual nature of human society, building connections while also guarding against threat, was present from the beginning of settled life. Another unresolved mystery lies in the meaning of deliberate burning. Some settlements appear to have been destroyed by fire at the time of abandonment. Were these acts of aggression, raids that ended with flames, or were they ritual closures, communities burning their own houses when moving on? Archaeologists debate these possibilities. Fire, whether violent or symbolic, left villages in ruins and reshaped landscapes for those who came after. From the broader planetary scale, these episodes remind us that farming societies, like ecosystems, are fragile. They balance growth and collapse, peace and conflict. The evidence of massacres and burned houses is not only a record of destruction, but also a reflection of adaptation. Communities that endured found ways to defend themselves, to forge alliances, and to continue despite losses. Thus, the shadows of violence lie across Europe's first farming societies. Alongside the rhythm of planting and harvest, alongside the promise of surpluses and the bonds of family, there is also fear. The bones of Talheim, the ditches of Schlitz, and the charred enclosures scattered across the continent tell of communities that faced dangers from without and within. Farming brought abundance, but it also brought vulnerability. In silence, the earth preserves these traces. Archaeologists uncover them carefully, knowing that each pit, each fracture, each burned timber carries echoes of lives cut short. The causes may remain uncertain, but the fact of violence cannot be denied. Farming in Europe was not only about taming land, but also about confronting the risks of rivalry, memory, and fear. Thus, the story of Europe's first farmers includes both abundance and conflict. Their villages, both thriving and destroyed, mark a landscape shaped as much by human tension as by nature's cycles. The shadows of conflict, preserved in bone and soil, remind us that the path of settled life was never simple, but always fragile. Inside the crowded longhouses of Europe's first farmers, life unfolds in patterns very different from the world of earlier hunter-gatherers. Dozens of people share enclosed spaces, with hearths burning, animals tethered nearby, and food stored for months at a time. These new conditions create stability, but they also open doors to unseen dangers. Illness, parasites, and infectious disease begin to shape human life in ways that had scarcely existed before. Step by step, the difference becomes clear. Foragers, moving often and living in small groups, face injuries, infections, and seasonal shortages. Yet their mobility limits the spread of disease. Farming changes the equation. Populations grow, villages endure for decades, and people live close to one another and to animals. Waste accumulates in ditches. Water supplies are used again and again. Grain sits in storage pits where rodents burrow and insects breed.
In this environment, pathogens find fertile ground.
One historical fact is visible in the bones of the dead. Human remains from early farming cemeteries show higher rates of stress compared to foragers. Teeth often carry enamel defects, thin lines where growth was interrupted during childhood illness. Bones show porosity linked to anemia, likely caused by parasites or diets low in iron. Arthritic joints and spinal wear reveal heavy labor, while abscesses and cavities point to diets rich in starchy cereals. Together, these signs form a picture of lives that were sustained by farming, but strained by its hidden costs. A lesser-known detail emerges from microscopic studies of settlement soils. Around hearths and floors, scientists have found preserved parasite eggs, invisible to the eye but clear under a microscope. Roundworms and whipworms once lived inside these villages, sapping energy and weakening the body. Their presence reminds us that the challenges of early farming were not only visible in labor and harvests, but also internal, carried silently within the body itself.
Yet mysteries remain. Did these villages experience epidemics sweeping through entire populations? Or were illnesses more sporadic? Some researchers argue that community sizes were too small to sustain diseases like measles or smallpox, which require large populations to remain active. Others suggest that close contact with animals, cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats, created opportunities for pathogens to leap from one species to another.
Many of humanity's later infectious diseases trace their origins to such interactions. The precise timing of these crossovers is uncertain, but the conditions were present in these very settlements. From the perspective of the planet, this marks a profound ecological shift. Humans, animals, crops, rodents, and insects all share the same spaces. Grain attracts mice. Mice attract fleas. Dung from herds spreads parasites. Stagnant water breeds mosquitoes. Farming villages become new ecosystems, where humans are one part of a web that includes species both visible and unseen. In this shared environment, microbes evolve, adapt, and spread. An unresolved question concerns the role of dairy. Pottery fragments preserve traces of milk fats, suggesting that early farmers processed milk into cheese or yogurt. Yet genetic studies show that most people of this era lacked the ability to digest lactose in adulthood. Did milk provide nourishment through fermentation, or did it sometimes contribute to illness when spoiled? The evidence is mixed, but it is clear that dairy was both an innovation and a potential risk. Another line of evidence lies in settlement patterns. Some villages are abandoned suddenly without signs of conflict or climate disaster. Could disease have driven people to leave? Illness leaves little trace in soil compared to fire or flood. But the coincidence of dense populations and abrupt desertion raises the possibility. When life in a settlement became unbearable through sickness, moving away may have been the only solution. Scale provides context. In a village of perhaps 100 people, a wave of illness could disable enough workers to leave fields untended. Crops would fail, food would dwindle, and vulnerability to hunger would rise. For foragers, dispersal often broke the chain of infection. For farmers, tied to houses and fields, illness could circle endlessly within the same community. This difference defines one of the deepest risks of settled life. Still, resilience shows through. Despite the presence of disease, farming populations grew. Children survived in sufficient numbers to sustain villages across generations. The stress markers in skeletons, those signs of hardship, also demonstrate survival. Many who endured illness lived long enough to heal, leaving behind evidence of adaptation. Human bodies began to develop immunities, passing resistance through generations, gradually reshaping the biological relationship between people and pathogens. At night, the signs of illness must have been familiar. In smoky houses, coughs lingered. Infants weakened by fever cried through long evenings. Elders bore the toll of infections that never fully healed. The constant presence of animals added to the challenge. Pigs rooting near hearths, cattle penned outside, dogs carrying fleas through doorways. Life was sustained by these companions, yet they also carried dangers. The archaeological record cannot capture the sound of coughs or the sight of fever, but it preserves their echoes in bones, residues, and microscopic traces. From a cultural perspective, illness may have influenced ritual. Figurines buried beneath floors, pits filled with offerings, and animal bones arranged in symbolic ways suggest that people sought explanations beyond the material. Perhaps disease was interpreted through spirits, ancestors, or forces of the earth. Though meanings are lost, the persistence of symbolic behavior shows that communities did not face illness passively. They sought understanding, protection, and continuity through ritual and belief. Thus, the farming villages of Europe carry within them a dual legacy. They anchor populations in place, feeding more people than foraging alone, and laying the foundations of later civilizations. Yet they also introduce a constant companion, disease, woven into the fabric of daily life. Farming is not only a story of fields, houses, and animals, but also of pathogens, parasites, and invisible challenges. The soil preserves this story. In enamel lines, in parasite eggs, in residues clinging to ancient pottery, the evidence endures. Illness was part of the rhythm of farming from its earliest days, shaping bodies, communities, and destinies. Europe's first farmers endured it, adapted to it, and carried it forward into every later age. For Europe's first farmers, survival depends not only on what their own fields provide, but also on the ties that stretch beyond the horizon. A village with poor harvests can endure if neighbors share seed or food. Stone for tools, shells for ornaments, and ideas for farming methods all move along paths that link distant communities. These networks of exchange, subtle but vital, form the hidden scaffolding of early farming life. Yet evidence shows that over time, some of these networks weaken. When they falter, communities face scarcity with less support, and their vulnerability deepens. Step by step, archaeologists follow these shifting patterns. In the early centuries of the linear band ceramic culture, villages across Central Europe display remarkable similarity. Pottery styles echo each other across hundreds of kilometers. Longhouses are built in consistent form, or with shared proportions and layouts. Stone axes of alpine origin appear far from their quarries. Obsidian from distant volcanic regions is found in settlements far inland. Such patterns suggest steady contact maintained through travel, trade, or intermarriage. A wide horizon connects communities, giving them resilience beyond their local fields. One clear historical fact is the eventual decline of this shared horizon. By the later 6th millennium before the present era, imported objects become less common in some regions. Pottery styles diverge, with villages producing distinct local designs rather than shared ones. What was once a broad cultural pattern begins to fragment. Archaeologists map this change not as sudden collapse, but as gradual fraying of ties. Connections that once bound communities into larger wholes loosen until each settlement depends more heavily on itself. A lesser-known detail lies in unfinished tools. In some sites, half-made stone axes appear, crafted from exotic rocks carried over long distances. Yet these tools were never finished, left incomplete in house floors or discarded in pits. Perhaps the skilled artisans who once shaped them were no longer available. Perhaps exchange routes that ensured proper craftsmanship were interrupted. These abandoned tools speak of disrupted networks, where the movement of materials no longer guaranteed the flow of knowledge to use them fully. The reasons for these cracks remain uncertain. Some scholars point to population pressure, with growing communities straining resources and competing rather than cooperating. Others highlight climate stress. During years of poor harvest, long-distance exchange may have become impractical as villages focused inward on survival. Still others argue that conflict between groups disrupted trade, making travel dangerous. The archaeological record does not resolve the question. It shows outcomes, isolated settlements, abandoned sites, but the causes are varied and interwoven. From a planetary perspective, the weakening of networks mirrors the fragility of ecosystems. Just as a field fails if deprived of rain, a village falters if cut off from support. A drought in one valley is manageable if grain can be obtained from another. Without exchange, the same drought can mean hunger, even collapse. Farming is thus not only about tending crops, but about maintaining threads of connection. When those threads fray, resilience diminishes. An unresolved question concerns the spread of ideas. Objects like shells and axes may vanish from the record when networks weaken. But did knowledge still flow? Farming practices evolved during this period, with barley becoming more common in cooler regions and peas joining cereals to restore soil fertility. Did such innovations continue to spread across fragmented landscapes, or did isolation limit adaptation? Archaeologists debate this, for ideas leave subtler traces than objects. The answer remains uncertain. Scale places these changes in context. A network spanning from the Rhine to the Danube covers distances greater than 1,000 kilometers. Yet its strength relies on countless small exchanges. A shell passed from hand to hand, a marriage linking families in distant valleys, a journey to flint quarries repeated across generations. Break these small link, and the whole system weakens. What appears broad and steady from afar is fragile when its foundations fail. The decline of large gathering places supports this picture. In earlier centuries, some enclosures seemed to serve as communal centers, perhaps for ritual or seasonal meetings. Later, many of these spaces fall silent. Their ditches fill with silt, their posts rot away. Whether gatherings ended or simply moved elsewhere, the loss of shared places suggests a narrowing of community life. The wide networks that once united multiple villages give way to more local rhythms. At night, in villages now more isolated, the sense of distance must have grown. Fires still burned, meals were shared, and fields yielded crops. But the ornaments and tools that once linked people to faraway landscapes became rare. A shell from a distant sea or a polished greenstone axe was no longer easily obtained. Without such tokens of connection, horizons shrank. Communities became more self-reliant, but also more exposed when hardships came. Yet, resilience remained. Local exchange between nearby villages continued, ensuring that no settlement was entirely alone. Families adapted by relying more on local resources, less on distant ones. What changed was the scale, not the existence, of networks. The decline of long-distance ties did not end farming but reshaped it, drawing boundaries more tightly around each group. In this way, farming endured, though with reduced capacity to absorb shocks from climate or conflict. Thus, the story of Europe's first farmers is also a story of connection and its fragility. Networks once carried stone, shells, and ideas across landscapes, binding communities into broad patterns of shared culture. Over time, these networks weakened, leaving cracks that exposed settlements to greater risk. Farming was never only about tending fields, it was about relationships with neighbors and distant lands. When those relationships faltered, survival became more difficult, and the resilience of communities was tested again and again. Among the many fragments left by Europe's first farmers, not all are tools or food remains. Some are objects that point beyond immediate survival, toward meaning, ritual, and memory. These items, preserved in soil for millennia, remind us that farming was not only about tending fields and raising animals, it was also about anchoring human life in symbols, stories, and beliefs carried forward from generation to generation. Step by step, archaeologists uncover these traces. Pottery fragments, decorated with careful incisions, appear in almost every settlement. Figurines made of clay, often representing human or animal forms, are found beneath floors or within ditches. Clusters of stones, arranged in deliberate patterns, mark spaces that were clearly more than practical. Together, These objects form a record of how communities sought to remember, to interpret, and to connect with forces larger than themselves. One historical fact is certain. The pottery of the linear band ceramic culture, the widespread farming tradition across Central Europe, carries distinctive designs, long curving bands, spirals, and cross-hatched lines decorate vessels used for cooking and storage. These patterns are not random. Their repetition across wide areas suggests shared traditions, perhaps linked to identity or ritual. Pots were touched every day, yet they also served as carriers of meaning. A vessel etched with lines was both a container of food and a container of ideas. A lesser-known detail lies in the figurines of clay. Some are simple, barely more than outlines of human shapes. Others show careful detail, arms folded, heads tilted, torsos marked with lines. Many are female in form, though their exact meaning remains uncertain. Scholars have long debated whether they represent fertility, ancestors, or household guardians. Some figurines are broken deliberately, with fragments buried beneath house floors. Was this an act of closure, marking the end of a building's use, or part of ritual cycles tied to seasons and harvests? The answer is unknown, but the persistence of figurines across hundreds of sites shows that they mattered deeply. Mysteries also surround the treatment of pottery. In some places, whole vessels are buried in pits, never used for cooking. In others, pots are broken and placed in ditches or around enclosures. Were these offerings to unseen forces? Were they ways of remembering events or of protecting communities? Archaeology preserves the act, but not the belief behind it. The soil holds shard, but not the words spoken when they were placed there. From the perspective of the planet, these symbols reveal how humans sought to place themselves within cycles of nature. Farming tied people to soil, rain, and sun. Each year depended on forces that could not be controlled. To carve lines on clay or place figurines in the ground may have been ways of giving shape to uncertainty. Through these objects, communities sought to make sense of rhythms larger than themselves. One unresolved question concerns the earliest communal monuments. By the late 6th millennium before the present era, traces of timber circles, earth mounds, and standing stones begin to appear in parts of Europe. These structures required enormous effort, far beyond what a single household could achieve. Were they ritual centers where communities gathered, or markers of territory claiming land for the living and the dead? The details are debated, but their existence suggests that memory and meaning were being anchored not only in objects within houses, but also in landscapes visible to all. Scale helps place these practices in context. A decorated pot or a figurine may seem small, but when repeated across thousands of households, the effect becomes vast. A single stone arrangement may mark a small ritual act, but when multiplied across regions, it points to widespread traditions of meaning. These practices form a cultural horizon as broad as the farming fields themselves. Feasting rituals provide another glimpse. Archaeologists find pits filled with animal bones, sometimes burned, sometimes carefully arranged. Such deposits suggest communal gatherings, where animals were slaughtered and consumed together. These feasts may have reinforced bonds, provided moments of renewal, or served as offerings to unseen powers. Though we cannot know the songs sung or the words spoken, the bones in the soil testify to shared acts of meaning that went beyond nourishment. At night, in longhouses lit by firelight, these objects would have held presence. A decorated pot by the hearth, its lines glowing in flickering light. A figurine placed near a sleeping place, a quiet guardian, a polished stone axe kept with care, perhaps never used, but held as symbol. These small acts, repeated day after day, year after year, gave farming life a depth beyond labor and survival. They tied people to ancestors, to spirits, and to the cycles of the earth. Still, mysteries remain. Did all villages share the same beliefs? Or did symbols shift in meaning from place to place? Pottery suggests shared traditions, but meaning is never uniform. A spiral carved in one valley may not carry the same sense as in another. Without language preserved, we can only see the persistence of form, not the variety of interpretation. Thus, the record of Europe's first farmers is not only one of crops, houses, and herds, but also of symbols etched, figurines shaped, and stones placed. These acts of memory reveal that communities lived within worlds of meaning as well as material. Their survival depended on harvests, but their identity rested equally on the objects and rituals that gave shape to uncertainty. The fragments in soil, the decorated vessels, the broken figurines, all remind us that farming life was more than a struggle against hunger. It was also a constant act of remembering, interpreting, and believing. Across the silence of millennia, these traces endure, carrying with them the memory of worlds where stone and clay held meaning far beyond their physical form. As centuries pass, the steady spread of farming across Europe begins to reveal unexpected turns. Villages are founded, fields expand, networks stretch, and symbols are etched into clay. Yet the record also shows that not all remained within the cultivated world. In some regions, people seem to step back from settled farming life, turning again toward forests, rivers, and wild resources. The story of Europe's first farmers is not only one of advance, but also of retreat, where communities blend cultivation with older ways or return entirely to the wild. Step by step, archaeologists uncover evidence of this shift. In certain valleys, settlements once thriving are abandoned, yet nearby, traces of hunting and gathering reappear. Stone tools suited for fishing and hunting persist even as pottery fragments fade. Faunal remains from some sites show increases in wild game, deer, boar, and aurochs, alongside or even replacing domestic animals. Charred hazelnuts and acorns appear again in storage pits. These findings suggest that families, or entire groups, sometimes readopted the strategies of foragers. One historical fact stands out. In northern and western Europe, but the adoption of farming was slow and uneven. For centuries after agriculture dominated Central Europe, large regions remained in the hands of hunter-gatherers. When farming finally reached them, it was often blended with wild resources rather than replacing them outright. Archaeological sites along coasts and rivers reveal mixed economies, where cereals appear in small amounts, but fishing and hunting remain primary. Farming was never a uniform path. It was a mosaic of choices shaped by landscape and tradition. A lesser-known detail emerges in isotopic studies of human bones. At some sites, individuals buried in farming cemeteries show diets unusually rich in fish, unlike typical agricultural diets dominated by cereals. These traces suggest that even within farming communities, families maintained strong ties to rivers and lakes. In other words, the return to the wild did not always mean abandoning villages, but weaving wild resources back into daily life. Mysteries remain. Why would communities step back from farming after adopting it? Some scholars argue that crop failures or disease made wild foods more reliable at times. Others suggest that cultural choices played a role. a deliberate preference for older ways of life that carried identity and meaning. Still others proposed that mobility was sometimes regained when villages collapsed, allowing groups to survive by reverting to flexible foraging strategies. The record shows outcomes, but the motivations remain unknown. From a planetary perspective, this pattern reflects human adaptability. Farming is not a single irreversible shift, but a set of strategies chosen and abandoned according to need. Just as climates fluctuate, so too do human ways of living. Returning to the wild demonstrates resilience, the ability to navigate uncertainty by drawing on deep knowledge of forests, rivers, and animals. Humanity's strength lies not only in cultivation, but in the capacity to move between lifeways when circumstances demand. One unresolved question lies in the blending of identities. Did these communities see themselves as farmers who occasionally hunted, or hunters who sometimes sowed? Archaeology blurs these lines. A household may have kept a few sheep while still gathering nuts and fishing daily. Pottery may appear in one layer, but stone harpoons in the next. These mosaics defy simple categories. The truth may be that identity was fluid, shaped by necessity, season, and choice. Scale adds perspective. To modern eyes, the transition to farming seems inevitable and universal. Yet for thousands of years, in Europe alone, farming and foraging coexisted. Some valleys carried fields and herds, while nearby hills remained the realm of hunters. Coastal groups continued to gather shellfish even after cereals appeared inland. This coexistence lasted not decades, but centuries, showing that returning to the wild was not rare or fleeting, but a recurring feature of early farming history. The cultural record reinforces this complexity. Pottery decorated with farming motifs sometimes appears alongside ornaments made of wild animal teeth. Figurines buried in house floors coexist with antler tools used for hunting. Such mixtures suggest that symbolic life, like diet, blended wild and domestic. Returning to the wild was not only about food, but also about meaning, keeping ties to forests and rivers even as fields spread. At night, one can imagine families in a partially abandoned village choosing to hunt rather than sow, to fish rather than tend herds. Fires burned by riversides, fish roasted on spits, nuts cracked on stone anvils. These scenes, though imagined, are grounded in the evidence of bones, seeds, and tools left behind. The wild remained present, waiting at the edge of every clearing, ready to be embraced again when needed. Still, mysteries linger. Did those who returned to the wild pass judgment on farming, seeing it as failure or burden? Or was it simply pragmatism, a response to hardship? Archaeology cannot capture the thoughts of these communities. It records only the choices made visible in material traces. Bones of wild animals, nutshells charred in hearths, tools fashioned for fishing. The motivations remain hidden, but the outcomes speak clearly. Farming was never an irreversible march, but a fragile balance within wider options. The story of Europe's first farmers is not only about sowing seeds and building houses, it is also about leaving fields behind, rejoining forests and rivers, and keeping alive the knowledge of wild landscapes. This return to the wild reveals that human survival has always depended on flexibility, on the ability to live in more than one way. Farming endured, but it was never absolute. The traces of wild foods in pits, of antler tools in villages, of isotopic signatures rich in fish, all remind us that early Europeans lived between two worlds. They planted fields, but they also foraged. They raised animals, but they also hunted. They built villages, but they also walked away. In this balance of choices lies the resilience that allowed humanity to endure through centuries of uncertainty. Across the landscapes of Central Europe, the traces of its first farmers begin to disappear. For centuries, longhouses lined river terraces, fields of barley swayed in summer winds, and communities gathered around shared hearths. Yet by the end of the 6th millennium before the present era, many of these villages are silent. The timbers of their houses collapse, ditches fill with silt, and fields lie untended. What had once been the great horizon of Europe's first farmers, the linear band ceramic culture, fades from view. Their villages vanish, leaving only faint impressions in the soil and mysteries that continue to puzzle archaeologists today. Step by step, evidence of this decline emerges. Excavated sites show repeated patterns, houses abandoned before their timbers fully rotted, storage pits emptied and left open, and cemeteries suddenly unused. Some settlements end with fire, their structures consumed in blazes that may have been deliberate. Others end in silence, their decay gradual but final. In each case, the outcome is the same. Once thriving communities no longer stand, and the rhythm of farming life shifts dramatically. One historical fact stands out. Around 4900 BC, the linear band ceramic culture, which had dominated much of Central Europe for centuries, comes to an end. Its characteristic pottery, marked with curving bands, ceases to appear. The longhouse tradition, so distinctive and widespread, is abandoned. Exchange networks that once carried obsidian, flint, and shells across hundreds of kilometers fragment and collapse. Within a few generations, a cultural world that had stretched across vast regions no longer exists. A lesser-known detail lies in what replaces these villages. In some areas, smaller, more scattered settlements emerge, with houses built differently and pottery decorated in new styles. These communities may have drawn partly on the legacy of earlier farmers, but they also show influence from forager groups and from new migrations. The disappearance of the old villages did not mean that people vanished. Instead, it marked the transformation of lifeways, from large, stable farming systems to more flexible, fragmented forms of existence. Yet mysteries remain. Why did such a vast cultural horizon collapse so suddenly? Scholars have offered many explanations. Soil exhaustion may have weakened farming. Without rotation or replenishment, fields lost fertility, forcing families to move or abandon agriculture altogether. Climate fluctuations, including colder winters and sudden droughts, may have strained harvests beyond recovery. Disease, spreading through crowded settlements, may have reduced populations.
Violence, as seen in mass graves and fortified ditches, may have destroyed entire communities. No single cause explains every site, and most likely, the collapse was the result of multiple pressures converging at once.
From a planetary perspective, these events fit into wider patterns of change. Pollen records show forests reclaiming abandoned fields, with elm and oak regaining ground once cleared for crops. Rivers shift their courses, leaving villages stranded far from reliable water. Soil layers reveal erosion, hinting that farming practices themselves may have contributed to decline. The collapse of Europe's first farming cultures was not only a social event, but also an ecological rebalancing, as landscapes reshaped themselves once human pressure eased. One unresolved question concerns the fate of the people who lived in these vanished villages. Did they perish in large numbers, victims of hunger, disease, or conflict? Or did they move, merging with neighboring groups and adopting new traditions? Genetic studies suggest continuity. The descendants of these first farmers lived on, their ancestry carried forward into later European populations. What disappeared was not people but culture, the forms of pottery, the style of houses, the wide networks of exchange. Lives continued, but the world they had built was no longer the same. Scale helps place this collapse in perspective. A single village might have held 100 people, its houses aligned and its fields stretching outward. Multiply this by hundreds of villages, and the disappearance represents tens of thousands of lives disrupted. To us, reading the record millennia later, it seems like sudden collapse. To those who lived it, the process may have been gradual, with families leaving year by year until only ruins remained. The perception of speed depends on the timescale. Archaeology compresses centuries into silence. At night, in the final years of a village, life must still have seemed normal in many ways. Fires burned, children played, and fields were tended. Yet beneath this rhythm, signs of strain accumulated. Harvests may have been poor. Illness may have lingered. Neighbors, once linked through exchange, may have become rivals. Rituals continued, but perhaps with an air of uncertainty. Eventually, the weight of challenges proved too great, and the community dissolved. What remained were bones in the ground, potsherds in ditches, and longhouses slowly sinking into earth. Still, the story is not only of loss. From the collapse of these first great farming cultures emerged new possibilities. Smaller communities, blending farming and foraging, carried knowledge forward. Later waves of migrants from the east mixed with local populations, reshaping traditions yet again. The vanished villages mark not the end of farming, but one of its earliest great transformations. The experiment of agriculture endured, though never unchanged. Thus, the empty fields and silent longhouses speak across time. They remind us of the fragility of human lifeways, of the delicate balance between soil, climate, disease, and society. They also remind us of resilience, for people did not disappear. They adapted, moved, and carried fragments of the past into new futures. The first farmers of Europe may have vanished as a culture, but their legacy continued, woven into the landscapes and lineages that followed. In the end, forests grew again where fields once lay. Rivers flowed past abandoned clearings. Birds nested where longhouses collapsed. Nature reclaimed what had been cut and sown. And in that stillness, the memory of Europe's first farmers was preserved only in soil and stone. To us, their vanished villages remain both a mystery and a lesson. That human societies, however innovative, exist always within fragile balances, subject to forces greater than themselves. Silence lingers over the abandoned fields of Europe's first farmers. Longhouses, once filled with voices, now lie hidden beneath earth and forest. The marks of ploughs are erased by roots, the furrows smoothed by centuries of rain. What remains are fragments, potsherds, figurines, bones, fragile traces of communities that sought to build a new way of living, then faded into the passing of time. Step by step, archaeology has revealed their story, the courage to clear forests, the patience to sow and harvest, the resilience to build houses longer than many of today's halls, the fragility of their balance with soil, climate, and neighbors. Each discovery offers a glimpse, yet also leaves unanswered questions. Why did their world unravel so quickly? How did they understand the challenges they faced? What song? What words? What memories were lost as villages dissolved? From a planetary view, their story is one of cycles. Human life adapts, expands, and withdraws, always shaped by forces greater than itself. Forests reclaim fields, rivers shift, climates change, yet people endure, moving forward with fragments of knowledge, blending old and new. The collapse of Europe's first farmers is not only a record of failure, it is also a record of persistence, of communities finding ways to continue beyond loss. Tonight, their memory rests in stillness. Beneath soil and meadow, their traces wait. The lessons of their rise and fall remain quiet but enduring. Reminders of how human life is bound to land, to season, and to time itself. In that silence lies continuity. In that silence, their story remains.